Welcome to the debate, Impact over Influence, how young adults are actually changing the world. Today, we analyze the ideas from the book, The Unseen Architects, Building a Life of Purpose and Impact.
Yes, and we are diving deep into this one today.
We are. So imagine it is, 7 o'clock in the morning. You pick up your phone, and before you have even had your first sip of coffee, you have already scrolled past a devastating climate disaster, a massive human rights violation, and...
Oh, and an impending economic collapse, usually.
Right, exactly. All before breakfast. And you want to help. You really do want to engage. But mostly, you just want to pull the covers up and go back to sleep.
Yeah, it is incredibly overwhelming. Because usually, when we talk about architecture or building a physical structure, there is this comforting expectation of visible, linear progression. You pour the concrete, the steel beams go up.
And you can point to the skyline and say, there is the progress, there is the impact.
Right, exactly, because it is tangible. You can actually measure the height of the walls. It is incredibly comforting because your physical labor directly and immediately correlates to a physical result.
But then you step into the landscape of modern social change. You are trying to build a life of purpose and actual influence in this hyper-connected, crisis-ridden world that just batters your screen every single morning, and suddenly that visible progression completely vanishes.
It really does.
We are looking at an architectural landscape of advocacy that is honestly completely chaotic.
It is the absolute definition of a structural nightmare. And I think the core challenge facing anyone trying to engage today is how to navigate this 24/7 cacophony without succumbing to profound burnout or information paralysis.
Right, or just that creeping cynical feeling that your individual voice is just too insignificant to matter anyway.
Exactly. If you don't have a blueprint to handle that psychological load, you will just be crushed by it.
And that brings us to the central framework we are analyzing today. And I'll be upfront, I am taking the skeptical side in this debate.
And I will be taking the believer's stance, arguing for the methods.
Right, so the proposal on the table here is that massive, sustainable, systemic change is not actually achieved through the loud, relentless confrontation we usually associate with political struggle. Instead, it requires a meticulously architected combination of radical self-care, strict information filtering, and empathy-driven grassroots advocacy. Now look, I hear the beauty in this framework, I really do.
But I sense a but coming.
A massive but. Honestly, when I look at entrenched, ruthless systemic power structures prioritizing concepts like, self-love and compassionate communication, it just looks like a privileged retreat from the urgent realities of actual political struggle.
Wow, a privileged retreat?
Yes. I have serious concerns that these methods, while theoretically very pleasant, are practically inefficient and honestly, dangerously slow.
Well, I look at the exact same landscape and see something entirely different. I argue that these methods are not soft, romantic ideals in the slightest. They are highly rigorous, strategic frameworks.
Rigorous? Okay.
Yes, incredibly rigorous. Viewing your emotional well-being is the ultimate renewable resource, and using empathy as a force multiplier, that is not a retreat. It is the only mathematically sound way to build the compounding, long-term collective power necessary to weave sustainable systemic change. Without this internal architecture, movements just simply collapse under their own weight.
Okay, well, let's test that architecture then, starting right at the foundation. The proposal suggests that personal agency begins with what is termed mindful disengagement.
Right. The tech-free zones.
Yeah. We are talking about implementing daily tech-free zones, conducting a weekly energy audit to prioritize purpose-driven rest, and viewing self-love as the core operating system for advocacy.
Which makes total sense to me.
Well, if you are listening to this and rolling your eyes at the phrase purpose-driven rest, I get it. It sounds a lot like corporate HR speak designed to make you feel better about doing less.
Oh, come on. That's a bit unfair.
Is it, though? Let's ground this in reality for a second. Say you have a 22-year-old organizing a local tenants union against a massive predatory corporate landlord.
Okay, fair example.
Right? When human beings are actively being evicted or a climate disaster is unfolding in real time, time is a luxury. Doing an energy audit feels like stepping out of a burning building to meditate on water conservation while the fire rages right in front of you.
Right, the burning building analogy.
Yeah. Is strategic disconnection actually just a socially acceptable term for abandoning the cause the absolute second it becomes uncomfortable?
No, not at all. I come at it from a completely different way, because your burning building analogy, while incredibly evocative, it fundamentally misrepresents the timeline and, frankly, the physics of systemic change.
How so? A crisis is a crisis.
If a literal building is on fire, yes, absolutely, grab a hose and sprint inside. But systemic injustice isn't a single building on fire. It is a generational, smoldering landscape.
Okay.
It has been burning for decades, and it will burn for decades more. If you sprint into that landscape without a respirator, you don't put out the fire. You just become another casualty of the smoke.
But doesn't the sheer urgency of the moment dictate the response? I mean, if you are constantly stepping back to recalibrate your energy, you are ceding ground to forces that literally never sleep. That corporate landlord isn't taking a tech-free Sunday, I guarantee you. Entrenched power structures do not do energy audits.
Well, they don't have to because they are sustained by capital. Grassroots movements, on the other hand, are sustained by human psychological endurance.
Okay, that is a fair distinction.
Right. Let's look at your 22-year-old tenant organizer. If that organizer doesn't turn off their phone on Sundays, if they just operate on pure adrenaline and righteous outrage 7 days a week—
Which, to be fair, is how most organizing happens right now.
Exactly. But we know exactly what the neuroscience says happens next. When your amygdala is constantly firing from chronic stress, you lose executive function in your prefrontal cortex.
So you're bringing biology into this.
Absolutely. You literally lose the biological capacity for complex strategic thinking. You start making tactical errors. You snap at your own coalition members.
Right, the infighting. We see a lot of that.
Tons of it. You alienate potential allies over minor ideological differences because you're running on fumes. That organizer burns out in 6 months, they quit, and the corporate landlord wins anyway.
I see.
The logic here is that purpose-driven rest is an active, vital component of strategy. It is metabolic. When an advocate steps away from the influx of crisis, they aren't abandoning the fight, they are metabolizing the information so they can return with clear problem-solving skills rather than just, reactive panic.
Okay, I see the biological necessity of what you were saying. I will concede that a completely depleted, highly reactive advocate cannot effectively organize a community.
Thank you.
But, and it's a big but, I am still not convinced by the broad application of this reasoning, because it assumes the individual has the privilege to simply step away.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Right? For many marginalized groups, the crisis is not something they just scroll past on a feed. It is their lived reality. They cannot do an energy audit on their own existence.
That is a very fair critique, and it is entirely true that the burden of rest is not distributed equally.
Right.
But I would argue that makes the mandate for those who can step back even higher. If you have the leverage to rest and recalibrate, you have a strategic obligation to do so that you can shoulder more of the burden for those who cannot. Emotional well-being is the ultimate renewable resource precisely because it allows for the resilience required to stay in the fight for decades.
Okay, well, let's assume I take your advice. I rest, I step back, I map out my energy.
Excellent.
But eventually, the tech-free zone ends, right? And I have to turn my phone back on. And the moment I do, I am just hit with a wall of disinformation, algorithmic outrage, and complex geopolitical data.
Which is the reality of the internet. Yes.
A rested brain doesn't matter if it is immediately hijacked by the digital environment, which brings us to how the advocate interacts with the world, specifically how they process information.
The decoding phase.
Right. The proposal outlines this 5-step protocol for critical engagement to avoid information paralysis. It mandates diversifying sources across ideological lines daily, utilizing dedicated fact-checking sites before sharing any impactful claim, and employing an emotional intelligence check to pause whenever content evokes strong anger or fear.
Yes, decoding the noise. In the modern era, this is an absolutely essential defense mechanism.
Essential, perhaps, in a controlled academic setting. But let's look at the practical efficiency of this protocol in the real digital age.
Okay, let's look at it.
I liken this process to checking the chemical breakdown of every single ingredient while trying to cook a meal in 5 minutes.
That's a bit dramatic.
Is it? If an advocate must pause, run a full emotional intelligence check, and cross-reference 3 ideologically distinct opposing viewpoints every single time they feel a spike of outrage, doesn't this mandate lead straight to paralysis by analysis?
No, I don't think it does.
But grassroots movements inherently require the momentum of shared, urgent emotion. Anger is the catalyst for action. If I see a blatant injustice, my anger is the correct moral response.
Sure, moral anger is valid, but
Asking young adults to intellectualize and cross-reference their outrage every time they open an app risks cooling the very fire that gets them into the streets in the first place.
I'm sorry, but I just do not buy that. Let me tell you why. That momentum you are talking about, when it is fueled strictly by unverified outrage, is incredibly fragile, and worse, it is actively being weaponized against you.
Weaponized how?
We have to look at the actual mechanics of the digital landscape. Misinformation, disinformation, state-sponsored troll farms, they do not just spread lies, they spread emotional contagion.
Right, they want you mad.
Exactly. They appeal to panic, fear, and sensationalism because that bypasses your critical thinking. Let's make this emotional intelligence check tangible. Think of it as the 10-second amygdala rule.
Okay, the 10-second amygdala rule.
Harvesting your anger. If you do not wait 10 seconds before hitting share so your prefrontal cortex can come back online, you are not building a movement. You are just an unpaid employee of a bad actor's engagement form.
Okay, that is a very clever way to frame it. I will give you that. But I still question the dampening effect.
Why?
If we require every participant in a movement to act like an investigative journalist before they can express solidarity, we dilute the collective power. You literally kill the momentum.
It doesn't cool the fire or kill the momentum, though. It focuses the laser. Look at the youth climate movement.
Okay, let's look at them.
That is a perfect case study of this working in reality. That movement did not succeed globally just because millions of students were blindly angry and retweeting sensationalist memes.
True. They had a very specific policy focus.
Exactly. Their actual power, the reason they secured seats at United Nations tables, came from a deep, verifiable understanding of the existential threat. They utilized diverse tactics, school strikes, digital campaigns, local policy organizing, all of which require complex planning, not just raw emotion. They cited the scientific consensus, they directed their energy strategically. The 10-second amygdala rule isn't about suppressing your moral anger. It is about asking, is this specific piece of content trying to manipulate my anger to sell ads, or is it providing verifiable facts that I can actually act upon?
So it's about credibility?
Yes. Informed skepticism protects the movement's public credibility. When bad actors inevitably feed your movement fake stories that confirm your biases, and you share them without checking, the moment those stories are debunked, the entire movement loses its leverage.
So the argument is that slow, verified truth ultimately yields a stronger, more resilient foundation than rapid emotional mobilization.
Precisely.
I understand the causal logic there. If you build a house on the sand of fake news, it washes away the second the tide of public scrutiny comes in. I see that.
Right.
Even if I still heavily question how realistic it is to demand that level of cognitive discipline from an entire generation constantly bombarded by crisis.
It's a muscle you have to build.
Sure, but this brings us to what is undoubtedly the most controversial pillar of this architecture. We've talked about internal rest, we've talked about filtering information, but now we have to talk about how we actually engage with the opposition. Empathy as a force multiplier.
Ah, yes. The ARC of advocacy. Acknowledge, research, connect.
Right. And specifically the underlying principle of love in action.
Which always makes people bristle.
Because it sounds absurd in certain contexts. The mandate here is to use active listening and perspective-taking to comprehend the underlying fears and experiences of ideological opponents, rather than just refuting their arguments or protesting their actions. It requires engaging in compassionate communication to purposefully lower the temperature of conflict. Now, I have profound reservations about the long-term viability and frankly, the safety of this approach.
The safety.
Yes. Approaching a corrupt institution or a systemic injustice with compassionate communication feels like trying to stop a moving freight train by politely asking the conductor how his day is going. It is just the wrong tool for the physics of the problem.
Only if you assume that the freight train operates completely independently of the people driving it, loading it, and maintaining the tracks.
But when dealing with bad actors, people or institutions who actively exploit mutual respect to maintain their power and maximize their profit, doesn't demanding empathy become dangerous?
In what way?
It places an incredibly unfair burden on the marginalized. You are asking those suffering under an unjust system to constantly validate the humanity of the very people who are actively harming them. It heavily risks normalizing the harm under the guise of understanding and finding common ground.
Okay, that is a crucial distinction to make, and I am very glad you brought it up, because we need absolute conceptual clarity here. Empathy and sympathy are entirely different mechanisms.
Go on.
Empathy is being proposed in this framework as a strategic tool, a method of tactical intelligence. It is not about condoning harmful actions, and it certainly does not mean you have to feel warm and fuzzy about the person driving the freight train.
It still sounds like you're giving them a pass.
Not at all. Sun Tzu would tell you to know your enemy. Empathy is how you map the sociological terrain of their motivations. Let's break down the ARC acronym you mentioned. Acknowledge, research, connect.
Okay.
Acknowledge does not mean validating the abhorrent action. It means recognizing the human motivation, which is often fear or economic anxiety, behind the opposing viewpoint.
And the research phase?
Research is the mapping phase. What incentives keep them acting this way? And connect is the tactical application. It is walking into a hostile local town hall and finding the one hyperlocal shared value that allows you to start a productive conversation rather than a screaming match.
Mapping the terrain is one thing. I am all for tactical intelligence, but compassionate communication implies adjusting your own behavior to accommodate their comfort.
Not their comfort, their humanity. And this is not just abstract theory. Let's look at a historical shift. Consider the fair trade movement and how it dealt with exploitative agricultural conglomerates.
Okay, a big, massive system.
Huge. And it did not achieve its impact solely through hostile boycotts or screaming at corporate boards. It succeeded because of millions of unseen threads of consistent empathetic engagement.
Empathy with a corporate board?
Yes. I mean, yes, consumers made ethical choices, but advocacy groups also did the grueling work of engaging with farmers, supply chain managers, and eventually the corporate executives themselves. They used empathy to walk in the opposing shoes and truly understand the severe economic fears and market pressures driving those exploitative labor practices in the first place.
So they found out why they were being terrible?
Exactly. And by understanding those pressures, they could propose alternative supply chain models that actually address the corporate fear of losing margins while simultaneously demanding fair wages for farmers. By lowering the temperature of the conflict, they opened pathways to collaboration that were previously deemed impossible. They shifted the collective consciousness and recalibrated the system's moral compass.
Okay, I see why you think that is a victory of empathy. But let me push back on the timeline and the durability of that victory.
Sure.
The fair trade movement took decades to achieve mainstream traction, and we could easily argue today that it still has not fully dismantled exploitative supply chains.
It's an ongoing process, yes.
The strategy of accumulating these unseen threads, this compounding effect of consistent, dedicated micro-efforts, is agonizingly slow. We are talking about micro-interventions into a macro system.
Mm-hmm.
If you rely on empathy to slowly shift a multinational corporation's moral compass, you are implicitly accepting that countless people will continue to be exploited while you patiently wait for the system to evolve. Confrontation forces an immediate cessation of harm. Empathy asks for a transition period.
I do not disagree that it is a long game. It absolutely is. But we have to look at the results of pure confrontation.
Which usually gets things done.
Does it? Confrontation alone often just shifts the harm to a new, slightly less visible arena. It creates compliance, not transformation.
Interesting distinction.
When you force change through purely hostile confrontation, the moment you look away, the moment the movement's energy dips, the system snaps right back to its original shape. Because the underlying values and incentives of the people within that system haven't actually changed.
I see.
The proposal of love in action argues that true impact isn't always a dramatic, overnight revolution that looks great on camera. It is a quiet, persistent evolution. If you want sustainable change, a change that doesn't snap back, you have to do the grueling, unsung work of community building, of active listening, of identifying shared values. You build alliances that can actually withstand pushback from bad actors.
So we are essentially dealing with a fundamental tension between the speed of the response and the durability of the result.
Exactly. And the argument is that speed without durability is a massive waste of the advocate's finite energy. If you use your energy audit to sustain your personal resilience so you don't burn out in 6 months, if you use the 10-second amygdala rule and the 5-step protocol to ensure your actions are based on verified reality rather than manipulated outrage, and if you use empathy to build unbreakable cross-ideological community alliances,
That's a lot of ifs.
it is, but if you do those 3 things, you become an architect of a system that outlasts you. It is a lifelong dedication, not a weekend project.
Well, as we step back and look at the entirety of this debate, the core disagreement remains quite stark.
It certainly does.
From my perspective, I remain highly concerned about the practical efficiency of these methods when applied to the real world. The reliance on self-pacing through tech-free zones, the incredibly heavy cognitive load of filtering every single piece of information, and the mandate to extend strategic empathy to ideological opponents.
You think it's too much?
I do. It all feels like a fragile, overly academic response to urgent systemic crises. The risk is that mindful disengagement and compassionate communication slowly morph into political complacency. We just cannot afford to lose the fire that drives urgent action.
And I maintain that the compounding nature of these highly disciplined, empathy-driven frameworks is the only historically proven blueprint for sustaining a legacy of change without destroying the advocates themselves.
Right.
It is not soft. It requires immense mental fortitude to practice active empathy when you are justifiably angry. It requires intense psychological discipline to rest when every algorithm and news alert tells you to panic. It is the hardest work you can possibly do.
I will say, regardless of our stance on the speed of these methods, we do fundamentally agree on one crucial reality.
The internet is awful?
Yes, the modern digital landscape is a completely toxic cacophony. Surviving it, let alone driving meaningful change within it, absolutely requires deliberate, conscious frameworks to protect your personal agency. You cannot just float through the algorithmic feed, reacting to whatever makes you the most angry, and expect to change the world.
On that, we are in total alignment. If you do not actively architect your own engagement, the system will gladly architect it for you, and it will use you for its own ends.
Exactly.
Which is why I view the methods laid out in the Unseen Architects as an absolute must-try operating system for anyone serious about long-term impact. It provides the necessary, mechanistic tools to turn individual sparks of passion into sustainable, collective power.
And I would advise listeners to approach these strategies with a healthy dose of caution.
Naturally.
Use the tools to protect your mental health, absolutely. Fact-check your sources, but remain hypervigilant. Ensure that your boundaries and your strategic empathy do not become walls that isolate you from the necessary, sometimes incredibly messy friction of real-world political struggle.
The friction is necessary, but how you physically and mentally withstand that friction is everything.
Indeed. In the end, we are all standing on the construction site of the future. You have to decide whether you are going to just throw raw materials at the problem in a panic, hoping something sticks.
Or take the time to read the blueprint, verify the integrity of the materials, and do the painstaking work of building alongside people you might fundamentally disagree with.
Exactly. The question isn't just what kind of world you want to build, but what kind of architect you are willing to become in the process.